Beautiful. Well, welcome everyone to the Gaffscast podcast. I'm Nikita Chronis. I'm here with Dr. Mario Baghos, the Senior Lecturer of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, also a PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Sydney. And we're here today to discuss all things ancient Greek storytelling leading into the medieval period and hopefully taking some of those motifs out into the modern period as well, and how we at Gaffs, as storytellers in all our various domains, can try to integrate these ideas in the stories that we tell, especially in 2025, which is hoping to be a big year. So thank you very much, Mario, for joining us.
Nikita, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It was a great pleasure to receive your invitation and a surprise. And, to learn a little bit about your project and what you're doing with Gaffs has been interesting on this end. Look, I mean, this recording, for the benefit of the listeners and also viewers, it'll also appear on my podcast, Terra Symbolica, as well.
Yes.
So that's all I really needed to say as a preface. Maybe you could give me something to roll with initially, and we could get the conversation going.
Absolutely. Well, again, I would just like to say as well that I found your work on YouTube, I think it was definitely during lockdown, and I was blown away with sort of getting into the history of things and history of Byzantium in particular. I took a great interest in that period of Greek history, and also into a large extent Orthodox history. And I found it fascinating just hearing you talk about the different motifs and the different legends that was sort of surrounding the consciousness of that time, how it bled into sort of, I guess, even modern Greek songwriting and songs. I'm referencing obviously the Marble Emperor, sort of these legends that surrounded the Byzantine period, but also how they were integrated into modern Greek history. And I found all these fascinating as an actor and as an aspiring filmmaker as well, someone who wants to tell stories and thinking, well, how can we sort of keep these traditions alive in the stories that we're telling now? So if we wanted to discuss, just to begin, sort of, perhaps if you have any idea about the particular mythological or historical motifs in ancient Greece that have shown in some manner some type of continuity leading into Byzantium and even leading into the into the modern period. And obviously, but wherever this conversation goes, we can roll with it. But yeah, well, how about we start there?
It is a daunting task to diachronically address ancient Greece and Byzantium together. There is continuity and difference there, as you can imagine.
Yep.
But certainly, if we're interested in talking about stories and narratives that are recognizable to us today, whether that's through the medium of, contemporary Greek Australian cinema, which is what your main interest is, amongst others, or even the kind of narrative of protagonist fighting an antagonist and growing in that process, that has dipped in Hollywood these days, but it's still the classical way of approaching storytelling. This begins with the dawn of what we would call Western civilization, conventionally speaking, in ancient Greece. The very first narratives, epic stories that, later on are kind of reflected in the sagas of the Norsemen, really do begin almost about 3,000 years ago. So we're looking at the 8th century BC if we want to speak about Homer, the blind bard from Chios, the island of Chios, who wrote the Iliad, which is a famous epic on the Trojan War, beginning 10 years into the war and not even finishing at the end of it. It's not about the war per se. It's a psychological kind of analysis of anger and wrath. Achilles' wrath, right? It's the first time we really get a narrative that's focusing in on a character and the consequences of his actions in a really practical way. The gods are there and they intervene, but it's a more, let's say, human-centric story. And then we have the Homeric cycle, which, all that's extant for us is perhaps the better work, arguably, the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, which, is just a little bit more, let's say, recognizable in terms of the motifs that are played out there. So why don't we talk about the historical context of these two works, together with Hesiod's Theogony, which is a very important text for understanding the origin of the gods and how they come into play, and what that means for some of the great heroes, let's say, not without controversy, especially these days, some of these figures, like, I don't know, Orpheus, Odysseus, Theseus, and Hercules, right? And that will cover more or less the ancient Greek period. And then all of this, which is unbeknownst to many, but it's true, and we have the documentary evidence, and scholars are bringing it to light, continues in Byzantium, because they had Apollodorus's library, for instance, which includes, the 12 labors of Hercules in full. That's a text that we have from late antiquity and continues until through the Byzantine period. We know that, for example, they had copies of Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, and some of the oldest manuscripts can be found to this day on Mount Athos in Greece.
Wow.
So this is all very interesting. Does that sound maybe like a good?
No, absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned the Theogony by Hesiod, because I think I've mentioned this to you, but where there's a wonderful piece by an author by the name of Charles Stewart. He wrote a book called Devils and Demons, I believe, in the Greek imagination. I think I got that correct. But nevertheless, he wrote this fantastic excerpt on Ta Exotica in modern Greek history, and sort of how the image of these ancient Greek gods sort of permeated a lot of even just modern Greek folklore. And obviously the root of a lot of these beasts in Greek folklore have their origins, so their root in Hesiod's Theogony, obviously through with various adaptations over the years. But I find it fascinating how, speaking of Homer and speaking of the I guess this sort of the most archaic Greek stories we have, that while there was obviously a change in religion in the medieval era, and obviously a change in an entire governmental style by the time we get to 1821, there is at least some semblance of a thread that connects all of these different Greek civilizations from that period to even now. So yeah, I think that's a great way to, if we can tackle those sort of more archaic stories, as you said, Homer and all that, and how they led into Byzantium. Let's absolutely do it. So what in terms of, I guess the biggest question that I have personally about the stories themselves, through a Christian lens, through a medieval Byzantine lens, Eastern Roman lens, were these stories, as far as you can tell, accepted at their face value for the values they espouse, or were they at the same time modified and sort of adapted to suit a more orthodox ethos, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Look, initially they were more or less, there's a dual approach in Byzantium with the advent of Christendom, Constantine the Great's conversion, gradual conversion of the empire to Christianity, which includes not only Greece, but also, Italy, Near Eastern cultures, Palestine, Syria, North Africa. These texts are still taught as part of the trivium and quadrivium, which is the main, let's say, curriculum of the ancient world for those who could go to whatever the equivalent of a university was back then. Usually schools led by famous teachers in Alexandria and later in Constantinople. There was, by the 10th century AD, we know, a Constantinopolitan university. But they taught the trivium, which is logic, grammar, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, which is arithmetic, astronomy, music, and geometry. So that all continued, right? But part of the trivium would have included reading these texts. So they knew about Homer, they knew about Hesiod. These texts were transmitted from antiquity through to the Christian Middle Ages, not only in Byzantium, but also in the West. Via monastics who transcribed them as part of their ascetical tradition. Now, in the 4th century, Basil the Great, right, will write his address to the youth, Basil of Caesarea, the Bishop of Caesarea, and he will say, they're just stories. You can psychologize them and read them and learn good things from them. Distinguishing the heretofore tumultuous relationship between the church and the exemplification, or let's say the dramatization of these stories in temple ritual, which is problematic. They consider it problematic. Idolatry, in other words. You don't worship Hercules. right? But you can have a statue of Hercules in your streets. It's fine. It's part of our ancient history. Constantinople just did that. It made that public, and that continues not just in Constantinople, but it becomes a staple, and it's emphatic because you can still see it to this day in Renaissance Italy. So if you go to Rome, you know, there are churches everywhere, but there's also pagan statues in the various museums, the Capitoline Museum, so on and so forth, Milan, Florence, Venice. It's all there. So they did that pretty early, but by later Byzantium, they did attempt to sanitize these stories as the empire was losing more and more territory to the Islamic incursions that began in the 7th century, and its borders were truncated. The mindset, as you can imagine, became more enclosed. And with that, it wasn't general, but it was an atmosphere of fear of, let's say, anything pagan, anything foreign to the Christian Orthodox ethos that was being cultivated. So, you know, there was an attempt in the 11th and 12th centuries to like allegorize the Iliad. It's a good text. The gods are actually meant to they're personified abstractions of love and war and everything else. They pushed that deliberately. That's no different to what Snorri Sturluson did in Iceland with the Norse gods. He did the exact same thing.
Okay.
Christianity was picked up by the Scandinavians. So when the Vikings became Christian, they're like, what do we do with Thor? Oh, Thor is actually a descendant of one of the Trojan heroes, and he came over here and he married an Icelandic native. And so you get what I mean. So there's an evolution. It's not like a static phenomenon, this one. But we know that in Byzantine 11th and 12th centuries, there are conscious attempts to imitate ancient Greek literary dramas and plays. We have, for example, and I'll hold it up for you because I was looking at it earlier today in preparation for our conversation, 4 Byzantine novels, right? Now, by Theodore Prodromos, Rhodanthi, and Dosiklis, by Evmathios Makremvolitis, Hismini and Hisminias, Constantine Manasses, Aristandros and Kalithea, and Nikitas Evgenianos, Drusilla and Hercules. They're all romances.
Yep.
They're all modeled on the kind of romantic tragedies that you'd find in Aeschylus, classical Greece, 5th century BC. How are they writing them in the 12th century AD, 1700 years later? It's because they've got Aeschylus at hand, and they've got Euripides at hand, right? All these ancient Greek tragedists and playwrights, classical Greek, properly speaking. Okay, so that's the Byzantine attitude. Now, there's also the famous text, the Digenis Akritas, which, you know, he's the two-raced or two-blood, they like to say in the English translation, border lord, right? Basil, who, you know, is half Greek, half Arab. This text emerges at the same time in around the 12th century. And he's fighting heroic deeds against villains on the borderlands, you know, where the Byzantine themata, the administrative regions governed by a general, where they kind of cross over into Islamic territory. And he is modeled on Hercules, like it's clear. He's like an Orthodox Hercules, basically. Right?
Yeah, and actually that's what I was partly going to ask is I think just bringing it back to sort of storytelling motifs, the immediate thing you see when you read any section of the Digenis Akritas is that these sort of, I guess, very basic archetypes of, you know, again, as you said, being on the borderland. You know, he's on the edge of two worlds. He's Digenis, he's two-blooded in some ways, and it puts us into the fringes of the society, and automatically as a storyteller you say, okay, well, in this part of the world that's outside sort of the civilized, the more urban landscape of, well, in that time Byzantium, but, you know, it could be easily sort of extrapolated into modern day. But this is where on the fringes of society you start to encounter these more fantastical elements of nature or even pagan gods. In the instance of Digenis, I believe he fights Charon, he fights death himself at some point, and obviously dragon. So it's fantastical. I guess the question I have, this is more of a number one historical question. Do you think that I've heard this before, I'm not too sure if it's entirely accurate, but to what extent was the Digenis and sort of these 4 novels that you mentioned influenced by the Crusader period with, well, you know, with these Western figures entering into Byzantium and sort of bringing forth their versions of romances and whatnot, or was it more, or do you think it was primarily derived from ancient Greek storytelling?
That's such an interesting question, you know. That's interesting. I've never thought about it. No, I think this is indigenous to Byzantium, if I can use that terminology. What you do get coming out of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, awesome stuff coming out of the Anglo-Saxon kind of context is Arthurian legend and romances, and they are embellished in that period with a more historiographical-like account of King Arthur's reign by Gregory of Monmouth in the 10th century in his History of the Kings of Britain. And then, you know, these texts develop from that point onwards. You have various Frankish texts and others that speak about native heroes to those lands, modeling certain crusader leaders and lords as and kings as a sort of eschatological emperors. Frederick Barbarossa and others, but I don't think that that decisively influences Byzantium. I think it could very well be the other way around, that Byzantium, towards the apogee of the empire with the Ottoman incursions and the fall of Constantinople, saw a great influx of Greek, scholars, Romans, still calling themselves Roman, Greek-speaking scholars and refugees coming from Constantinople, Platon, the great late Byzantine philosopher, among them, and going and teaching in Italian schools, and they brought their libraries with them. Vessarion was a very famous Byzantine who became a Catholic cardinal, commissioned various bishops in the Peloponnese and others to find as many manuscripts as they could so that he could salvage them, because there was a real threat that in his mind that these could be lost and burnt, you know, and so on and so forth. So they ended up in Venice in a library that he established there. And this is not just philosophical work, it's also literary texts. That goes hand in hand with the Renaissance. So it's not for no reason that in Italy around this time, in places like Florence, which was run by the Medici, you know, the Medici family invented the Platonic Academy, named after the place where Plato would teach, the grove of the god Academus in Athens. And so the Platonic Academy was initially run by Platon, you know, who was, in the imperial court, basically, in late Constantinopolitan times. And he was teaching ancient Greek from a lot of these sources, from a lot of these texts, to the Italians. And then all of a sudden you get statues of Hercules and Perseus and Medusa. Within 100 years, you get Benvenuto, his famous statue of Perseus holding the head of the Gorgon Medusa.
Yes.
It's in Firenze. It's in Florence.
Florence, yeah, I've seen it.
You've seen it? You've been there?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I haven't been to Florence. I've been around Italy quite a bit, but not Florence. Yeah.
Florence is remarkable, a remarkable city. I mean, in terms of artistry, it's just breathtaking. It actually hurts your senses after a while when you get back into the apartment or the Airbnb or wherever. Like, I'm overwhelmed with how beautiful this place is. But yeah, sorry, continue.
No, so as in short answer, I think this stuff is inherent to a kind of a continuity that happened within Constantinople, where they put all of the statues and manuscripts and everything else that came out of the Greco-Roman context, because they did call themselves Romans, the inhabitants of Byzantium, multi-ethnic, multi-kind of lingual. Latin was the administrative language of the empire until the 7th century. Greek was the ecclesiastical language. Nevertheless, they revered that Greco-Roman inheritance that is anchored in cities like Rome, cities like Troy, cities like Delphi.
Yes.
All of that plays out in the Constantinopolitan landscape. By the time you get towards the Middle Ages, it's starting to wane, that consciousness. It's still there, but you know, by the time you get to the Fourth Crusade, for example, everything is stolen and lost. So that period after the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when the Byzantines reconquer the city in the 1260s, where are all the statues of Hercules and everyone else? Well, they've been melted down and sold in Western Europe, you know, or they've been preserved intact in Venice. In fact, if you want to see the Greco-Roman inheritance of Constantinople, you need to go to Venice, and you'll find it all there, basically, or as much of it as they were able to preserve, you know.
Yes, yes. So that's fascinating to me. So would it be safe to say that much of sort of, at least from a literary perspective, the grand epics of Greek mythology and of Greek literature, archaic Greek, ancient Greek literature that made its way into Byzantium, was subsequently morphed and also to some extent destroyed by, again, the Crusaders and sort of the tumultuous period between the West and the East at that period of time. That if it wasn't for in some way those Greek intellectuals or those Roman intellectuals moving to the West and sort of imparting that I guess that literary and philosophical tradition to the West, that the motifs, the stories that we even tell now, or even in modern Greek history and sort of the nationalistic stories surrounding that period of time as well, wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for this sort of survival of these few texts into the West. Is it safe to say that?
That's another interesting observation. I think the Crusaders, we need to nuance, because even well, you know, I mean, you're not gonna the Crusade happened, and you know that the Pope John Paul II since apologized for it. You know, it was 1,000 years ago. We're not going to bring up old vendettas, right? The Franks were have been described as destructive to these particular artifacts and manuscripts, but not the Venetians. The Venetians kept everything.
Interesting.
So they went in and took it all in situ, took it out, and kind of kept everything preserved.
Yeah.
So that is one, because, you know, the paradox is, Nikita, as much as people want to speculate about what if Constantinople continued, let's say, I mean, it was 1,000-year-old empire when it ended. That's pretty long. By any empire standards. The encroaching, and not to say that the Ottomans did not have their art and culture. They did eventually, you know, with at least the period that follows after Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople, Suleiman the Magnificent and others. They had their art and architecture and everything else. You can still see these things in Istanbul if you go today. But the threat of losing them was perhaps even greater based on the Ottoman kind of, well, not, but in this period, you're talking about Seljuk, okay, 1200s, right. Seljuks, and then later it's the Ottomans. Yeah. So the paradox is as much of as a tragedy, this is not, again, justifying it, as much as a tragedy, the Fourth Crusade that sacked Constantinople was, it also paradoxically and ironically preserved the legacy of Greece and Rome.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, and, you know, a lot of people don't want to admit it. It's just a fact. Go to Venice and you'll see it all there. You know, you would not have seen it in Constantinople because part of the policy of later sultans, they preserved a lot, but they also destroyed a lot. So, you know, the Venetians at least had this tact. They're like, oh, this is valuable stuff. I mean, this can help us grow our own empire. And it was a maritime kind of equivalent of an empire. It wasn't an empire. It was run by the Doge, but, you know, you get my meaning.
Yes. No, it's fascinating how sort of these things, as you said, play out ironically in some manner. Through that destruction, you do find, I guess, a form of salvation in at least in terms of preserving that Greco-Roman heritage.
Well, preserving, and I'd also add elaborating upon it, because some of these Renaissance masterpieces are just masterpieces.
They're amazing. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to go, you don't have to. I mean, it's not an overstatement to go to, if you simply go to Italy and travel the country from top to bottom. It's, as I said, it's breathtaking. Seriously, the type of art on display. I guess, look, I want to ask this question. This is more from a gaffs-centric perspective. Part of what we want to do this year is we want to be able to create our own stories that focus on what I would consider, what many of us at gaffs consider foundational Greek values, Hellenic perennial values, such as Philotimo, agape, levendia, philoxenia, and the like. And we're, at least I'm firmly under the assumption that these values are not only taught as in some type of, I guess, in a scholastic fashion, in the sense that you just pass down this value and stress its importance, but I think a great part of these values are imparted in the stories that we've told over the years through, you know, whether you hear stories about your papu in the village, you know, acting kind to someone, or some cute story like that that sort of stayed with you as a kid or even into your adulthood that you try to emulate in your life. I think at the crux of them, it's good storytelling, and storytelling that has these values in there. I guess might be a little bit of a stretch, but I'm personally wanting to find the thread in the values that I just mentioned before, like Philotimo, Agape, and the like, how they had their origin in potentially ancient Greek stories such as the Odyssey and in the Iliad, but also how they, I guess, morphed into the modern period through the structured systems of Byzantium. I guess this is quite large, but basically what I'm getting at is how these values were wrapped in the stories that they told during that period of time, whether in the medieval period or ancient period, and how that sort of continued on. Because just from the top of my head, thinking about the Greek Revolution, thinking about sort of the nationalistic sentiment that came from the West through like Lord Byron famously, and all the Philhellenes that made their way to Greece, there was this sort of resurrection of Philhellenic, ancient classicist motifs that in some ways, I think it's safe to say that the West sort of reintroduced into the Greek populace, especially the locals who may have had some semblance of knowledge of these stories and these attitudes, but were in large part disconnected due to the Ottoman oppression and education and whatnot. So I'm interested in finding out how these stories, with their imbued ethos, made their way and continued into the modern period, and what examples of these stories we have currently. The first thing that I can think of really is, I think you've mentioned it also on a previous podcast, the idea of the Marble Emperor and the Sleeping King coming back and sort of taking off the yoke of Ottoman oppression, or at least it doesn't say that specifically, but the return of the king sort of coming back and setting things right. That's obviously a massive archetypal, I guess, motif that has its origin through Byzantium, but perhaps even earlier, but was able to stay in the consciousness of these Greeks during that time. Do you have any other examples, or is there anything you want to add to sort of that line of thinking, or am I just way off on this?
No, you're not. No, this is very insightful. Your reflections are very insightful, and they're provoking a lot of thoughts in me. Look, Philotimo and Levedia, being from the Levantine, the Levant area,
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's what it is. That's what it
Oh,
means.
I didn't know. Wow.
It's being part of that Near Eastern kind of milieu that includes Greece. Is Greece Eastern? Is Greece Western? God only knows, right? That's
Wow.
yeah. But it's being a young man from that area and being, robust and full of life and that kind of thing. The Philotimo, giving friendly honor, let's say, to a stranger, welcoming the stranger, is a way of looking at Philotimo. All these things are reflected in those ancient narratives. What I think is the best, by far the best and coolest thing about ancient Greek stories and the protagonists that are depicted there, male and female, but it's embedded, it's kind of recapitulated in some of these male figures in a way that has been relevant for storytelling across cultures in the West in particular. Not to say that other cultures and civilizations didn't have equivalents, because this stuff is to a large extent archetypal, as you mentioned before.
Yeah, universal, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
It's part of the human experience, but bloody heck, the Greeks, they wrote it well, especially the ancient Greeks, because, for example, okay, everyone in the Greek world, ultimately it's a more or less pessimistic worldview, unless I'm talking about ancient Greece now. I'll leave Byzantium. Let's leave Byzantium to one side for a minute. Unless you're a hero, if you're a mortal, your fate is to enter Tartarus, right? And there are various ways you can respond to that. Tartarus is the underworld, and there are various locations that you can physically enter, and the Greeks knew about these locations in northwestern Greece and other places. The Italians had the same. So if that's the case, then that means that one is fated to die. So destiny plays a big role. Fate.
Yes.
Tyche, right?
Tyche, yes.
Tyche. Okay, so this is there in the Iliad, in the Odyssey already. And the heroes in the Iliad is not as developed from this point of view, because although there's a lot of, it's Achilles' wrath in not being... He's not a good comrade to Agamemnon and Menelaus for various reasons. Okay, he doesn't want to share the loot, which, this is the retrospective analysis would be one of toxic masculinity and misogyny, yeah, because the loot includes all of the women that they conquered and everything else. But, 3,000 years ago, we're not justifying that, but let's leave that reading out of it because it doesn't help us. That's how those patriarchal, warlike societies were then. It's Achilles' wrath that causes, after the death of Patroclus, his friend, his vengeance to pour out in a way that really publicly shames King Priam of Troy.
Yes.
And
Yes.
he kills Hector and then drags his body on the horse and carriage around the city several times. And at the end of that story, after all that murder and death, and people being dispatched and there's shades entering hell. Basically, that's how it describes them. And sometimes the gods would intervene and help them. You had famously Zeus, Athena, and Hera helping the Greeks, the Argives and the Spartans and the Mycenaeans, and then you had everyone starting with an A: Ares, Aphrodite, Artemis, etc., helping the Trojans, right? And nevertheless, their fate is to die on the battlefield, and at the very end of the work, the final book, Priam comes and entreats, like on his knees, for the body of Hector to be returned to him, because Achilles had it. And Achilles magnanimously gives it back. And that is an example of, what do you want to call it? Give me a Greek word, a contemporary Greek word that describes it.
Yeah. Or Philotimo.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. That is. Yeah.
It's a very compassionate thing in that context. It doesn't sound like it to us. Like, why didn't he just give the body
But
back?
yes, yeah. In the context of this sort of primordial war, just all out craziness happening all around you in an ancient period of time where it was in many ways might equals right. There was this modicum of real beauty and in some ways love for the enemy in a weird way. It's this moment of, as you said, Philotimo. There's no other better way to describe it than Philotimo. Yeah.
So you found it right there. It's there 2,800 years ago. But then with, Odysseus, things become developed in an even better way. Odysseus is a much more interesting character because on his journey back to Ithaca, he falls in love with what's her name, Circe, and all these, there are all these things that happen to him, misadventures. Poor Odysseus. I really, but as you're getting towards the end of the text, like, oh, this poor bastard,
Yeah, absolutely, I know. Just sidetracked after sidetracked after wrong island. It's fantastic.
That's right. But a motif that appears there with all of his hardships and his cunning and smart, wise and clever Odysseus and
Metis. So
sure-footed.
they say metis. Is that the word they use for? I think there was some word that was used to describe his cunningness. It was meti.
Is that right? Because that's also a goddess. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to check, but there was something to do with that word. But anyway, yes, please continue.
No, that's very interesting to know. But in order to get some information on how to get home to Ithaca, he has to go to the mouth of Tartarus at his lowest point, when he's been waylaid, when he's lost his friends. And that represents, if you want to think about it as the hero's journey, it's the way Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century described this heroic arc, which is so important for contemporary fiction, whether you're looking at not the new ones, the original Star Wars films, or whether you're looking at The Lord of the Rings, both as a text and later as film adaptations, or Harry Potter. It's there. The hero leaves familiar surroundings. Now, in this case, Odysseus left them a long time ago when he left Ithaca. So he's already been through the ordeal of Troy.
Yep.
And that's been transformative in the sense that he's the one who came up with the Trojan horse. Yeah. That's his idea.
Yes.
And so
from the horse,
the horse is his idea, right? So when he finally reaches a low point, he goes, I need to go consult the particular prophet, I forget his name, Tiresias, I think, at the mouth of hell. Right. And all of these, he performs irrelevant sacrifices, and he leaves this warm blood in the milk from the sacrificed animals that he's offered up, and they begin to come, the shades of the dead, and he encounters them. And here the author, Homer, let's say it's Homer, he'll include entire myths. So, when Theseus turns up, you get to hear about the Minotaur. When Hercules turns up, you hear about his labors. So it's a chance for the composer of the text to retell some of these older myths, okay, that have filtered into the narrative. This is all still within the parameters of the heroic age. The Greeks had this sense of the it's in Hesiod's Theogony, the Golden Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, and the Age of Heroes. And the writers themselves were living in the Age of Iron, which is not a good one. But the Age of Heroes includes both Hercules and Odysseus. And after getting the relevant information from the dead in Tartarus, that he will indeed return home, he will indeed greet his wife, who's remained faithful to him, he will meet his son Telemachus again, then he is given the courage to continue the journey. This motif, we have to do, I've done it a few times, I'm going to do it again. Do we have time? Do you mind?
Absolutely. No, as long as you're okay. Yeah.
Man, I'm loving it. It's great. So we'll do a sojourn to Italy again, because after this this text, we know the story. He gets back to Ithaca, nobody recognizes him. He's recognized when he shoots the arrow through the axe head. All these things. He gets his home back. Okay. And there were more stories, but they've been lost. It was part of an 8-part series. We've only got the 2 texts. The Iliad, named after Ilus, who founded Troy, right? Named after his father Troas. It's called the Iliad because Ilus was the founder of the city. And the Odyssey. 600 years later, 700 years later, during the Roman Imperium, the Roman Empire, right? When Augustus becomes emperor, the nephew of Julius Caesar, Octavian. He's become emperor, and he's consolidated power. Eventually, he'll deify himself within his lifetime, and he's the first Roman emperor to be worshipped as a god. His main propagandist is a poet named Virgil. Virgil writes the Aeneid.
Aeneid, yes.
Which continues the story of the Homer's epic cycle. But he wants to connect Rome to Troy because that story is so foundational and epic for heroism, for valor, for vengeance, which was big for the Romans. Their pietas, their piety is vengeance. It's exacting vengeance on the enemy. So now that text, I think, is even more sophisticated, obviously, because time has passed. And the Odyssey, because Aeneas goes through a similar journey to Odysseus, but as he's a Trojan, of course, and he'll eventually found Latium, which is also a place visited by Hercules. So they're trying to mix the heroes there. But eventually from Latium, the town of Alba Longa is founded, and Romulus and Remus come from Alba Longa, and they go and found Rome. So Romulus and Remus are considered descendants of Aeneas, who came from Troy.
Yes, yeah.
But Aeneas, he falls in love with the queen of Carthage, Dido, right? And when he has to leave her because he falls in love, he gets lazy. So on the journey, he gets complacent.
Yeah.
Beautiful lover, beautiful beaches. I'll get to founding Latium,
Right.
Never riesce, do you know what I mean?
That's right, exactly.
And Mercury appears, Mercury's Hermes, the messenger of Zeus, and scares the hell out of him. You had a job to do, that kind of thing. And he's roused, and then he leaves, right? He leaves, and Dido had been affected by one of Cupid's darts anyway. She was manically in love with him. And the description of him leaving while she's screaming, yelling, it's not like a histrionic, the way that they would, I think, in a very ill-informed way sometimes, an exaggerated way, depict women in 19th century novels, these histrionics. It's meant to prove a point. She's histrionic, and putting all of that on Aeneas. And Aeneas is described using Stoic terminology, that he was like a tree being buffeted by the wind, and he felt sorry for her, but the roots were deep in the ground, and so he was not turned off course. So he continues his journey. Now, he also has to go to the mouth of Tartarus, which he finds in Italy, right? And there he wants to speak to his father, Anchises, okay? And Anchises, after he enters the mouth of Dis, they call it, the Latins. Dis is also the name of Hades. Hades rules Tartarus and the underworld generally in Greek mythology with Persephone, but Hades and Dis become, let's say, interchangeable for the topography as well. Eventually, Hades is hell in Christian context. So, when he gets there, his father gives him this narrative that, you'll go on and you'll found Latium, and look, behold, I see the armies marching as far as the cycle of the sun and even beyond it. and amongst them are, and he names Julius Caesar and Augustus, as his descendants. And so that gives him the motivation to go on and found Rome. But all of the politicization of this motif, because that's a politicization of the motif that is there in the Odyssey, which is also about the hero finally getting to his home, is something much deeper. And the older myths get it. The hero has to face hell and has to come out transformed. He has to face his lowest point. That could be, in a modern Greek Australian narrative, drug addiction, or it could be losing a loved one, or it could be getting into a car accident. It could be something. You have to feel that lowest point, but then something has to rouse that person to be able to be transformed by that experience and go on to complete their mission, their journey. Their goal. And so in the case of Odysseus, it's to get home to Ithaca, and to his family. In the case of Aeneas, it's to found Rome, even bigger. And in the case of some of the earlier figures who go down there, Orpheus also goes into the underworld to fetch Eurydice. And Orpheus is the great lyre player, the son of Apollo, who plays the lyre, and his music is beautiful and tames wild beasts. But he's not at all successful. His life is mapped out as a tragedy, because when he goes into the underworld, which itself has a space reserved for the heroes, the Elysian fields, that's the only good place in Tartarus. If you die a hero on the battlefield, everybody else is a shade. Persephone grants him the wish, much to Hades' reluctance, to take Eurydice, who had died, she was bitten by a snake, out of the underworld, on the condition that he doesn't look back. And as he's taking her out, she's following his lyre as he's playing it. And as he reaches the exit, he happens to turn back, and the entrance to Tartarus closes.
Wow.
Him forever. That's a romantic version of this story. And Orpheus's fate is to eventually be torn apart by the Aeneas, the Furies, and for his head to be placed in a temple, prophesying constantly. So he doesn't have a good ending. I think the only one who manages, out of the very famous ancient Greek heroes, to come out of the underworld more or less unscathed is Hercules. He's hurt. He captures Cerberus, the three-headed dog. It's his final labor.
He comes out on top.
He comes out on top. He sees the spirit of the Gorgon on the way down there. That was Medusa dispatched by Perseus. Perseus are these older heroes who chronologically are ancestors of the Trojans. Perseus is the great-grandfather of Hercules, for example, and the Trojans come after Hercules, right? And the Greeks who fight against the Trojans, and so on and so forth. But Perseus, because he was such a good guy, he gets a good ending. Doesn't go into the underworld, but he defeats the Gorgon, cuts off her head, while looking in the reflection in the shield and all of that. Hercules manages with his final labor to capture Cerberus. Theseus, because he wasn't such a good guy generally, he defeats the Minotaur in the labyrinth and all of that. That's a wonderful story, full and rich with meaning. Because he's nasty to Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, who he promises to marry after taking her from Knossos and from Crete, he abandons her on the island of Naxos, and he does a few nasty things to some other women. He gets stuck in Tartarus for quite a while, and Hercules spies him during his final labor when he's going to grab Cerberus, and drags him out as well, to save his friend Theseus. But Theseus has an ignominious end. He gets thrown off a cliff and dies that way. So, you can go to the underworld, you can come back transformed. It doesn't mean you're going to have a good ending.
Exactly.
That's the point,
you're not going to come back unscathed for the most part. There's going to be it's going to take a piece with them. You're not going to come back fully, obviously transformed, yes, but something has to die, as that motif is. Some part of you has to die in order for you to be reborn. And as you said, like, these motifs and these archetypes, it's such a fundamental archetype in any type of storytelling. It's, the death and the resurrection. In anything, right? When you're writing a script about someone, as you said, it could be drug addiction in some modern context, the sort of the dissolution, losing everything, losing your family, all this stuff. And then at some point, at the lowest point, that's where the transformation happens. These are fundamental psychological as well as narrative motifs that help us, I guess, navigate ourselves in the world. And just sort of to bring it back to gaps a little bit, I had a few ideas about this because part of when I first, I guess, came up with the idea of starting something like a Greek Australian Film Society, I wanted to find out, as I mentioned the values before, the Philotimo agapi and philoxenia and the like, levendia. I wanted to find, I wanted to locate where the line was between good storytelling and propaganda, because a lot of what you mentioned there before about sort of these political figures utilizing these stories, you know, as you mentioned, the Romans with their pietas and vengeance, being descendants of the Trojans, and also what comes to mind, Alexander the First, who was one of the earliest, maybe the first, but one of the earliest kings of Macedon, when he was wanting to participate in the Olympic Games. There was the Greek Council of Elders, you know, that had to determine whether or not someone was sufficiently Greek to even join the Olympic Games. He had to prove his descent from the Heraclidae, I believe, or the House of Hercules, in order to sort of participate in this event. And the royal element to that was very important, because as soon as you connect yourself to some level of royalty in your past, well, you're surrounded and clouded by the stories of these gods, as you mentioned. A lot of times in the ancient world, there was, I'm a descendant of a particular god, whether Ares or Zeus or Apollo, whoever it was. It was a way of granting yourself legitimacy. And in a funny way, I actually see that in some of the, I don't know if you're privy to this, but there's a lot of DNA discourse, particularly now, because there's a lot of amazing advancements in genetics. And people, particularly, this might be a little bit controversial, but in our parts, in the Balkans and in Greece, people can become very obsessed with sort of they're tracing their genetic lineages, and I find that interesting, because it's in a weird way, it's a psychological archetype that has its roots in the ancient world, which is I'm trying to find who I connect with in my past, at least as a group of people that I can say, well, look how noble my bloodline is. It's the same type of it's the same archetype playing itself out in a different era, and I think that's where there's a funny line between finding storytelling that espouses values or has at its core certain values, like the ones I mentioned before, without it becoming propaganda. That's one thing, and I think there's a continuous discussion that needs to be had between, in this case, a writer or a filmmaker or a storyteller, in finding that balance between, because you don't want to tell a story that obviously has an overt agenda. You want to tell a truthful, honest, and also entertaining story that has these elements at play, or else you're detaching yourself from the audience. If I watch a movie that has no relation to me whatsoever on any human level, then I'm just not going to enjoy it. But if I see a story of someone overcoming struggle, as you mentioned before, or going into the depths of their Tartarus in their own lives and coming out transformed, that is going to spur me into not only loving the film, but also potentially making changes in my own life. So I think there's this line there that is so interesting, because these stories, the Odyssey, the Iliad, are so foundational and so fascinating, but they can also be used in a political context, at least in the examples that you were using, for your own personal gain and also for your own political agendas. That's one thing. Another thing that I thought of when you were talking was that idea of going to the underworld. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there was a post-medieval, a modern sort of Ottoman times rehashing of that same motif, but it unfortunately involves a Ottoman official who captures a lady from a village and takes her down to the underworld. Have you heard that story?
No, but tell me about it. Tell me what
Well, I think I've read in places that it's almost a direct retelling of either Persephone or Demeter. I forget the ancient figure, the mythological figure, but basically the story is an Ottoman general goes to this village, finds a very pretty girl, steals her, takes her to the underworld. I think in some version it's the underworld, or in some versions it's this castle, is somewhere outside the village. And there's a hero that has to go through these sort of various periods of adversity in his life in order to get to her, and also these struggles, physical struggles, and eventually he has to fight him. And the Mother Mary appears at some point, and he rescues her and saves her. It's a classic, like, hero's journey coming to rescue the damsel in distress, right? That type of story. But it's almost a direct retelling of this ancient story. I'm yet.
it doesn't go away. Sorry, Nikita. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that it's fascinating how even on a local level, even amongst people who were ostensibly not as educated as we are, in the Horia, in the villages, there was these stories that existed that obviously had their roots in the medieval period, but also in the ancient world. And they were able to be, I guess, retold in a way that suited not only their particular context, but also had its own, in this instance, political motives. This is sort of where the propaganda comes into play, because your enemy now doesn't become sort of the enemy of mankind, death itself, or Hades, or any type of figure like that. But in this instance, it becomes the enemy of our particular people, the Turks, in that context. So it's just, I find it so fascinating how these threads kind of made their way into the modern period, but at the same time, they were transformed. They were transformed to suit that context. And the question is now, how do we do that in the future, and how do we do that in the films that we're going to tell? But that's a different story. So, yes.
Well, that's so interesting because, yeah, definitely this retelling of the descent into Tartarus, the Katavasis, that's the name of it in scholarship, the descent motif. It's kind of fundamental to the Christian experience of Holy Saturday, because the descent into hell narrative is hinted at in the Gospels. For example, when Christ is crucified, we're talking about Byzantium, which becomes emphatically Christian. Christ is crucified. In Matthew's Gospel, you have a rendition of the crucifixion whereby some of the dead are raised at the crucifixion, right? And are seen wandering around Jerusalem. And there are all these, the curtain of the temple is torn in two, and there's an earthquake, etc. Then in St. Peter's epistle, the first epistle, there's a reference to Christ preaching to the spirits in prison in the underworld when he dies, right? So that's where he is on the Holy Saturday. It's partly why at the Proti Anastasi service on Holy Sunday morning, there's the rattling of the church, and everybody starts hitting things and the bay leaves are thrown. That represents Christ destroying hell. Christ enters hell and he comes out of it changed, as in resurrected. He's defeated death in his person, right? He enters it dead, let's say. Well, his soul enters while his body is in the tomb, and he rises out of it and brings all human beings, exemplified by Adam and Eve, who had died beforehand, up with him. But in the texts that describe this, that emerge in the 2nd century, the more elaborate texts, they're like narratives. One of them is called the Gospel of Nicodemus and the Acts of Pilate. It's an apocryphal text, which means it's a hidden text. It wasn't included in the New Testament scriptures, in the canon of the New Testament. It was left out, but its imagery influenced church tradition, East and West, Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Oriental Orthodoxy as well. So in that text, Hades, who's now he's personified as the underworld generally. He's not the god anymore, obviously. He's talking with Satan, and Hades has an inkling of what's about to happen. Someone's about to come that's going to ruin our whole project here, Satan, because Satan is the master of sin and death, and he's been sending people to Hades, right, for so many generations. And Satan still hasn't quite understood. No, we'll be able to keep him out, And then you have this banging on the doors of Hades, the King of Glory shall come in. It's something like that, Who is this King of Glory? The Lord Mighty, the Lord Mighty in battle, verses of the Psalms. And then Christ bursts into Hades, destroys its doors. They fall in a cruciform shape in the icon on top of Satan. And then he takes Adam and Eve and takes them out of hell. So it's not, because he's the Son of God and not just any hero, right? It's not enough for him to enter and to come out transformed. He has to go in and destroy it.
Destroy the thing, yeah.
Jesus is the destroyer of Hades, So that's epic. And that is part and parcel of lived experience in Byzantium. So you have it part and parcel of every Holy Saturday night, plus the texts are floating around. And these texts get adapted. Now, you found a political version where the Ottoman is the one who takes the girl down into the underworld. What if I told you there's a comedy version I forgot about it. Now I'm mentioning it. The 11th century called the Timarion. It's called the Timarion. It's translated into English. You must find this text.
Yes.
That describes this bloke Timarius going to Salonika, to Thessaloniki on the feast day of Saint Demetrius.
Yes.
Experience a festival, but he eats too much at the Panigiri, and he's sick and he dies. And his soul is wrenched from his body by the demons and dragged into the underworld. But a whole comedy of errors unfolds where, he's thrown this way and that way. He encounters people he knew when he was alive. And that comedy version of it, it's a comedy version, is anticipated 1,000 years earlier by Seneca the Younger's Apokolokintosis. The pumpkinification of Claudius, of the Emperor Claudius. It's a comedy, it's a satire written by Seneca, who was eventually forced to kill himself, right? He was
Is this Seneca the Stoic philosopher?
The Stoic philosopher, yes.
Yeah. Wow.
It's a satire. He makes the Emperor Claudius look like a dolt who's dragged into the underworld and forced to serve the previous emperor and put into the law courts and turned into a pumpkin and all these sorts of things, right? So that's all around. Now, what we were talking about at the beginning, we're talking about how all these texts, they're there in Byzantium. There's debatability to what extent. In Rome, a lot of this stuff was preserved because the papacy was the light of education in the West. But, when all of this stuff begins to get transmitted gradually through further connections with Byzantine intellectuals, what you get in the 1300s, remind me, what's the date of Dante Alighieri and his Divine Comedies?
Was it the 14th century? Was it? I think it was after the fall of Constantinople, maybe.
Dante, let me just get a date for him.
Yeah.
I should know this.
No, I've slipped my mind as well.
So obviously he's a Florida.
I feel it's the 14th century.
Yeah, it's early 14th. He's late 13th, early 14th century.
Yeah.
So it's not it's after the fall of the city to the Crusaders. So they would have taken a lot of stuff back.
Yes.
It's not the final fall of the city in 1453. Yeah. Dante writes the Divine Comedy, which of course is modeled on the Aeneid because Virgil is his guide through the underworld. He's looking for his long lost love Beatrice, and he begins in the underworld, and he goes through all the levels of hell. And Cerberus is at the very bottom, sucking on the heads of Satan and Judas and Brutus, who betrayed Julius Caesar. So being a traitor is the worst sin, and then there are the various levels of hell. Different sins are punished in different ways, right? And where's all this material coming from for Dante? It must be coming out of these texts.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
And then you got the purgatory, and then you got paradise. I mean, he builds his narrative around all of that. So obviously Dante's doing a lot more. Dante is like, it goes Homer, Aeneas, the Bible, Dante, Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Tolkien from
put it together.
Chaucer. But these are the great writers, right? Like the landmarks, revolutionary. And Dante is one of them, and he's using this material as well. And so the hero, in this case, himself, being led by Virgil, goes through all the layers of reality, from hell through purgatory into heaven, looking for his long-lost love, who he finds contemplating the Blessed Trinity. How do you take such supernatural, let's say, themes, which are, it's been done. Look, it's easy to do it with fantasy literature and with fantasy stories, okay? So when Luke Skywalker in The Empire Strikes Back is dying in the snow on Hoth, what does he see in that moment of, he sees the ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi go to the Dagobah system, and then he goes and finds Yoda. Now, this is a long version of the hero's low point, because Yoda trains him, but the most decisive moment is when he enters the cave and he fights the ghost of Vader, and he defeats it, but it's actually him, all that awesome stuff, right? In that,
yeah.
The Empire Strikes Back. So it's easy to do that. That cave is the underworld. He faces the fact that actually Vader, he's related to Vader somehow, and then he finds out it's prescient, because in the underworld you get messages about the future, past, present, and future collapse into one another. So it anticipates the final revelation in the film when Vader tells him, "I'm your father, Luke." That's a sick movie. Empire Strikes Back. Nobody
Fantastic.
underestimated it. It's such a great film. But you know, Aragorn, okay, this is literature again, but done well in the film. Whose help does he get at the end of Return of the King to fight against Sauron?
Oh, I forget. I forget.
The King of the Dead.
don't-
The King of the Dead.
Right.
He goes into the underworld and brings up the King of the Dead and his forces who were consigned there to help fight against, you know, Sauron and his minions. So, you know, this is look, Harry Potter, the last
Yes.
book and the last film. He actually dies in the arms of Voldemort, right? But love conquers death, and he comes back and defeats him. That train station bit is like the underworld again. So
Yeah.
you can do it in these things. How do you do it in a clever way, in a realistic narrative?
Yes, and it's funny you bring that up because I was having this conversation the other day about horror films, and one of my I guess it's a guilty pleasure of mine is when I don't really want to get too invested in some type of drama film or a film that will force me to sort of get emotionally invested and sort of tear me apart by the end of it. I will watch a horror film, even if I'm just sitting at home, just on the couch with my girlfriend or whatever it is. And a lot of the times I find that with horrors, particularly really well-made ones, all those elements, because it has a fantastical sort of underpinning as well, are there in spades, in fact, particularly the good films. Like there's always the idea of, for example, and I learned this also just studying film at university, there are these classic sort of, even in some ways conservative motifs about the sort of the virgin, the virgin in a film who is untouched by sin and malevolence will most often be the last to die, if not die at all. She won't die at all. In a lot of the cases, it's a female, but it can be a male as well. That the idea that the more you participate in bad behaviors and whatnot, you're most likely going to be punished first and foremost by whatever demonic spirit is out there in sort of outside.
The Exorcist has that.
Yeah. So with horrors, it's actually quite prescient. You can see it very quickly. These themes are there.
Yeah,
the trick is, as you asked, as you said, is how do we integrate this into sort of more, I guess, psychological, dramatic films or stories, and the best writers and the best directors and the best storytellers will do that. For some reason, my mind keeps thinking, have you seen the film Kramer versus Kramer?
No.
It's with Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep. It's about a divorce, and you just go through the whole thing with them. And it's just this constant battle between these two characters. It's a really good movie, and it has a little bit of controversy now because of due to something quite terrible that happened backstage. But regardless, the film itself is very interesting, and there are these symbolic patterns there. There are these sort of archetypal motifs about starting in a more paradisal space, the slow dissolution, and then the transformation at the end. But as you mentioned before, in terms of when you go into Hades, you're not necessarily going to come out unscathed. There's going to be something that's changed. You might not make it. It's the same thing there. The image is not of a reformed family that goes through the rut and just sort of, has these fights and then comes back finding their true love again. No, it ends with the final image as a spoiler. They see each other in an elevator and they just look at each other. They don't say anything and the doors just close. But you can tell through their acting, their amazing performances, that there's this longing for each other still, but it's done. They just know it's done. And
wow, that's cool.
Great film, an amazing movie. And again, it's this whole thing, these motifs are there, but it's obviously not as in your face as you would find it in a fantasy or in a horror.
The most emphatic way, and I mention this only because sadly David Lynch passed away recently. May God rest his soul. What a visionary director. And Twin Peaks. Did you ever watch Twin Peaks?
I haven't, but I've heard so many good things about it. Yes. Yeah.
I've got one of the versions up there on the bookshelf. Box set. It does this motif because there's a lot of supernatural elements in it so well, but the protagonist is not successful, at least initially. So you have to watch the original series and then Twin Peaks: The Return, and the film. I'm going to see the film again on Monday. Actually, we're going to do a video with my mate Russell about
Oh, that's great.
Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, which was released 30 years ago, but why not see it in the cinema now that it's that there's everyone's celebrating his work. Look, it does it well. But even okay, look, you've given the example of Kramer versus Kramer, which is purely a realistic story, something that tragically happens. Goodfellas.
Yeah.
Okay, ending of Goodfellas when Henry is paranoid. Like he was never really a good guy. All right, he was never good. He's from bad to worse, Henry Hill. Okay?
Yeah.
At the end, after experiencing the hell of almost being killed and losing everything, and his wife almost being murdered, he's left with nothing. You remember that final scene when he's an average schmuck, So it can be done. Now it just depends on genre. I don't know about I don't know anything about Greek Australian or Greek cinema beyond Politiki Cousina, for example. That's not my area. So maybe can you recognize some contemporary Greek films that play out this hero's journey, which includes more than just that? We focus on the descent into hell, that kind of nadir, but it's that coming out of familiar territory, being spurned to action. The familiar is lost, the unfamiliar challenges one. And through difficulties, one is perhaps guided, but then there's a low point, and then from that low point, they're able to rise and be successful. Do you
Well, there's one film that I watched recently. It's the first film that comes to mind. It's actually a Greek-Australian film. You should check it out. It's called Voices in Deep. I've spoken about it quite a few times now with a few people. But it's a filmmaker by the name of Jason Raftopoulos, an amazing filmmaker. And the film is basically set during the refugee crisis in Greece. The film is with the backdrop of the refugee crisis. The film has multiple elements working at once. There's sort of a variety of, I guess, miniature stories within it as well. But I guess there's one moment in that film that really stuck out to me. And it's actually, I guess, to some degree, a reflection of, I think, what Aristotle talked about in the Poetics. I'm trying to remember this correctly, but there's a point in the protagonist's journey when they have to make a choice. There's a choice that will lead them down one path or another. A lot of the times, I think there's this emphasis, particularly in Greek tragedy, of hubris, right? Where the protagonist strives so high that at some point they get hit, they get knocked down, and that's the end of them. And there's obviously more variables within that. But there was this one point in the film. It's so just. It was crushing just to watch, but the protagonist, who has, if I remember this correctly, was moving through the most terrible situation in Greece. He's a refugee from the Middle East coming into Greece, and with his family, and he's kind of just trying to make ends meet and whatnot. But there's this one choice where he's obviously responsible for the rest of his family that he's with, for his brother and I think his sister as well. Again, my memory's a bit hazy, but there's a choice that he makes that he's provided with from I think the Greek state at that point, which is your brother either has to go or you have to go, or it's one or the other essentially. I might be getting this wrong, but regardless, that moment of the film is not what determines the rest of the story, because it was towards the end already, but it was the moment that we see the resolution of the film. It's like, what path is this character going to take? How is this going to end up for him and his family? And it's this kind of climax where you don't know what's going to happen. You've seen this family and this person go through so much. And it's not ostensibly even a political film. It's just sort of going through what this person had experienced in his life living in Greece. And there's this point where he has to make a choice, and you're waiting on it, and and you see this character crumble, trying to come to a decision. And once that decision is made, that's essentially it. That's the end of the film. And it's just this I guess small sequence of events afterwards that illustrate the results of that. But it was this sort of fork in the road. And I remember watching that, being like, that is so powerful, just in terms of a narrative technique that we've been built up throughout this whole. We've seen this up and down, this crazy whirlwind of stories within stories, and the multiple accounts of adversity that these people are going through, and it comes down to essentially this one decision. And you're just hanging on every word. And it might not be directly sort of related to, I guess, a lot of these archetypal motifs, but there is something about that. There is something about the hero having to make a very pivotal decision that will determine everything else. And obviously, we see that in our lives every day. And it doesn't have to be that monumental, but a million small choices create the rest of your life, right? So it was so impactful to me watching that and sort of hanging on every word in that scene. And I remember speaking to the director, Jason, and it was very emotional for him too. And I ended up speaking to the actor as well who played that character because I was mesmerized by his performance. But I think from a Greek Australian perspective, that is definitely one story. There's also another film called, I don't know if you've heard of Odrakos. It was a film by a Greek filmmaker by the name of Nikos Kounduros. And it was set, I believe, during the time of the Greek military junta. And even from the title's perspective, there is already that sort of archetypal vision, which is Odrakos, the dragon, right? Or the ogre. It's translated in English to the ogre of Athens. And
Strange, okay.
yeah. And it's about this essentially persona non grata within Greek society. Again, I think he's politically seen as a pariah, but wrongly so as well. There's some issue going on there, but he's this archetypal outsider. But even at some point in the film, again, it's this sort of motif of having to go into Hades in order to transform yourself. In this instance, it's integrating this Drakos, this ogre, into common society, and then the society transforming, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse, because I think in a lot of these archetypal sort of mythological narratives as well, there is this element of danger that comes with trying to, as you said, go into Hades and coming out unscathed. It can also be in the form of, trying to reach out to someone on the ends of the earth, or trying to make contact with the monster, like in Beauty and the Beast, right? There's this element of danger there that you're not too sure is going to go down well. And in this instance, it's a political pariah, and the way he's integrated into this sort of community, it starts off quite rosy, but by the end, it ends in tragedy. So, look, it's just innumerable, an innumerable amount of examples from Greek filmmakers and Greek storytelling. Even in instances like, as we mentioned before, the Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis, which I haven't read. I've only seen the film, a Scorsese film. But that was also, as we mentioned, highly controversial. But all these elements are there. Again, it might be easier because it's a bit more fantastical in the sense that it's dealing with sort of religious proportions. But all those elements are still there. So, yeah, anyway, I was just trying to rant off what I could remember. But
no, it's great because I don't know this stuff. So this is all new to me.
I would really recommend watching Odrakos. Definitely watch Voices in Deep. And it's just, I think I might have a bit more of a personal connection to it because I know the director, but the filmmaking and the acting is fantastic. It was actually shot during COVID. And I've spoken to him about sort of the issues that he had to go through in order to get that shot. But yeah, really heartfelt storytelling. Yes, so I think that, as you said, it's not as obvious when you're dealing with sort of real world scenarios, or I guess one-to-one scenarios, or dramas like a divorce or something that can happen every day. Yes. But I think that's the challenge of the storyteller, particularly someone who wants to create a story relating to the Greek Australian experience, relating to sort of everyday life here. The Odyssey obviously has perfect parallels to this idea of longing for home and homecoming, going back to the motherland, all these things. And there are definitely stories that are there for the taking in some way. It's just a matter of how to get into and tap into these archetypes without them becoming on the nose. Because you can also fall into that trap. There are so many. I'm sure you have examples as well of stories that are, I guess, so obviously laden with this symbolic imagery that it can become kind of like, oh, of course the dragon is going to be hoarding gold, or the.
Oh yeah, that can happen. I mean, there are avenues that one can take where the unexpected banality of everyday life can dress these sorts of motifs. I mean, you could easily consider, for example, I don't know, you could set, for example, a Greek-Australian film in the space of one entire night, the misadventures of trying to get the Aeneas at midnight,
Mm.
you know, ending up on the wrong side of town and having to fight for your life. But you could do something. You could do something with folklore and superstition, Vastania, if you like. Do you know what I mean? And that's not, these things don't come to the foreground, but, you know, every Greek Australian knows about them, you know. What happened that morning is that your granny said to you, you know, nase matiaso, and you said no, and then your day went bad. You know, that's a story, right? There you go. All right, you can get me a beer when you.
That's it.
But you know, these things, they could be done as short films, because we had discussed some of the modes and methods that you're going to try to implement. Definitely, definitely, and we should continue speaking. I mean, if there's something that you want to kind of work on, and need
of course, yeah, absolutely. I think we've got a couple of projects, and we can wrap up now as well. How long have we been going for? How many? What does it say there?
Just over an hour and a half.
Beautiful. No, well, we've got a couple of projects this year that we're looking to develop, and also we're constantly writing as well. But I think that what I personally got out of this, but also I'm sure GAPS members as well, overall, obviously a great education in terms of sort of the origins of our cultural stories, the stories of our heritage, our Greco-Roman inheritance. Also, just how it relates to, you know, certain instances of these myths and these foundational stories making their way into the modern period, and again, also how we can use a lot of these things in the stories that we tell now. And that's exactly what I wanted to get out of this. So I really appreciate you coming on, Mario. I'm sorry that I know that it's late for both of us. We're in the same country, but
no, don't worry about that. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you. It's been really enlightening for me as well, Nikita, and enjoyable. So thank you. Yeah,
no, thank you very much, and we'll definitely talk again. If we do have, if I personally have any sort of ideas and wanting to get your opinion on perhaps making it a little bit more accurate, historical accuracy or mythological accuracy as well, I would love to hit you up as well, and so maybe we can have a chat.
Yeah, happy to, anytime.
Beautiful.
We can do another one of these just on folklore.
Yeah, that would be great. Well, I'm gonna
cover it.
Yeah, I'm gonna be speaking to that person I mentioned, Charles Stewart, the author who again wrote this piece on Da Exotica and has written a book about it. Yeah, you got to check it out. It's seriously fascinating. It would be great if you two could link up as well, because just in terms of I've read it and been blown away with sort of he's collated all these different stories from various villages around Greece and surveyed them. He's an anthropologist actually, and again talks about how these sort of folkloric elements have transitioned from the ancient time into now, and how it affected everyday life in a koryo. It's absolutely fascinating. So I'd love if you two could connect as well, but that's for the future. That'll be great. Thank you very much, Mario. We'll talk very soon.
Thank you, Nikita.
Thanks for coming on. Yeah.